Greetings dear friends, I present to your attention the most common malfunctions and breakdowns that occur on the Peugeot 407. The suspension of the Peugeot 407, as already mentioned, is standard spring, as the maximum is relied on controlled shock absorbers. The front two lever is quite strong, the front silent block of the L-shaped lever and the ball joint of the lower arm, less often the upper ball joint and the shock absorber itself with the spring and the strut support require attention. With careful operation, the resource of all elements is more than 500,000 kilometers, but very few people manage to get to 100 without repairs. However, especially economical ones manage to drive for years on a dead suspension without changing anything, since the 407 has good sound insulation. The resource of wheel bearings is from 100 to 150,000, depending on the driving style and the diameter of the discs. The multi-link rear suspension is very compact. The resource mainly depends on the load and a degree of pollution. The relatively large angles of travel of the suspension guarantee a low resource of silent blocks, especially in cold regions, so knocking from behind for owners of the 407 is a common thing. It is worth repairing it only with high-quality parts, and this is exactly the case when repair parts made of polyurethanes show themselves well, especially for the diagonal lever, one of the most loaded. However, in this case, a lot depends on the quality of the assembly and insulation. The original Peugeot struts are traditionally long and very durable, but the same cannot be said about the adjustable shock absorbers on cars with V6 engines or on a coupe. After 50-60,000 runs, the first failures began. It will not work just to replace the shock absorber with a regular one. In the kit you need to change at least the front supports, which have a different hole diameter. The rear shocks will also need a new eyelet. The price of the original steering shock absorbers is about 3 times higher than that of a regular struts from a good manufacturer and slightly higher than the price of the expensive yellow Koni Sport for this model. Steering on the 407 with the e-gear and a rack. A fairly reliable rail flows when installing large wheels and dirty oil, but in general its resource is usually 200 plus. E-gear is able to fail in several more ways. Burning of the fuse contacts and burnout of the track in the BSM block is the smallest trouble. Problems with the wiring to the pump, which is frayed, are always a little more difficult. There is more damage. In the pump itself there are speed sensor failures and board corrosion. While the mechanical part of the pump requires regular fluid replacement, which most owners forget about. The normal replacement interval is 30-40,000 kilometers, otherwise the pump may not last more than 60-80,000 kilometers. Four-wheel drive 407 do not exist in nature, only in film fantasies. All cars are strictly front-wheel drive. Cars with gasoline engines 1.8 and 2.0 as well as with the diesel engine 1.6 were equipped with a 5-speed manual transmission BE4. With diesel engines 2.0 and 2.2, as well as gasoline engines of 2.2 liters, the 6-speed ML60 gearbox was already working. There were already 3 automatic machines. Gasoline engines 1.8 and 2.0 were equipped with a 4-speed automatic transmission AL4, with engines 2.2 and diesel engines 2.0, also a 4-speed, but more durable ZF 4HP20 worked. After restyling, this 6-speed AM6 TF80SC was paired with diesel engines 2.0 and 2.2, but with all V6 engines with gasoline 3.0 and diesel 2.7 and 3.0 it was originally installed. There is nothing special to tell about mechanical boxes. They are quite reliable. The main problems of the 5-speed BE4R are associated with high mileage and a missed oil level or its severe contamination, as well as the wear of the shifting mechanism. In advanced cases, the differential doesn't withstand in the first place. The bearings hold to the last and the bearings of the output shaft can whine a little for years. The wear of the synchronizers gradually makes it difficult for the gearbox to work quickly, but the transmission usually doesn't knock out. Stage wear and stretching of the shift cables are common problems in the 407, as in the Citroën C5. The lever strokes are doubled up to the impossibility of engaging the first or third gears. The levers rest on the panel. At the same time, the mechanism is nominally not collapsible. The stage costs about 20,000 rubles and is supplied complete with cables. A used one will cost half the amount, but there is usually no point in buying it. It has a wear rate of at least 50%. There are 935 720mm cable on sale, but the original kit cost at least 7,000 rubles, so they get either compatible ones or a stage assembly. Collective framing is also widespread, since the restoration of cables is not a very complicated procedure. New keys are printed on a standard inexpensive cable on a 3D printer, and the plastic removed from the old cable is placed or simply removed from its place, and the persistent sleeve is rearranged on the shirt if the condition of the cable doesn't cause concern for its integrity. The 6-speed ML6C differs from the 5-speed in terms of operation, except in the use of a dual-mass flywheel. It's quite resourceful. On average, it requires replacement after 200,000 run, and it costs about 25,000 rubles for the original Luke, which is not so expensive. Its full diagnostics without removing the basket is very difficult, although you still need to monitor the taps. Otherwise, the same difficulties with the rocker and backlash, slightly less pronounced due to the software operation of the shifting mechanism and with the wear of the synchronizers. But the differential is noticeably stronger. It breaks down very rarely. It is difficult to change the 5-step to the 6-step one. It will be necessary to change not only the drives and supports but also part of the exhaust, and even the subframe for cars with a 6-speed manual gearbox is different. Such a replacement is practiced only on diesel engines, for which the BE4R is rather weak. The French automatic AL4 gearbox with German roots is not one of the strong points of the Peugeot 407. It can be added that its history began in the 80s, when Volkswagen sold the license to manufacture the 01M, 01N gearbox to Peugeot Citroën. The basic design remained the same, but the French changed the dimensions of almost all elements in order to exclude any mechanical compatibility, and the boxes of the resulting AD4 series turned out to be quite reliable. AL4 is essentially the same AD4, but with some modifications, a new valve body and electronic adaptive control. The modernization brought with it all the troubles that PSA with Renault that joined them. Where AL4 is called DPO, DP8, haven't gotten rid of until now, 20 years later. The mechanical part inherited from the ancient Volkswagens is in order here. It can withstand a moment of up to 220 nanometers. However, an attempt to cheaply modernize an archaic design with an active lockup of a torque converter GTL and an intelligent control unit, coupled with an initially extremely weak cooling system, led to a wave of failures. In almost all cars, this box doesn't have a separate automatic transmission radiator and is content with a heat exchanger, which provides a greatly increased thermal regime. The blocking lining of the gas turbine engine is actively wears out and supplies dust to the oil. The valve body becomes clogged and a self-destruction cycle of the unit starts. Due to oil starvation, the temperature rises, and with serious overheating, its body shrinks. In general, after 120–150,000 mileage, a good overall design, if you do not take measures in advance to preserve it, turns into a disabled person requiring either overhaul or replacement. When the box starts to switch to cold blows, the repair should be already include not only updating the gas turbine engine, replacing the oil and filter which is hidden inside, but also washers in its mechanical part, pistons of packages, all rubber bands, and a complete bulkhead of the valve body. Less expensive repairs usually do not help the situation, since the destruction is complex. There is some good news too. The box is relatively inexpensive to repair, technologically advanced and capable. With clean oil and accurate operation, with a timely replacement of the gas turbine engine, step over the threshold of 300,000 km before the first opening. The driving mode is also strongly influenced. With a calm, measured dry, the temperature usually doesn't exceed 90 degrees, but sharp accelerations in the urban cycle can raise it by a critical 15–20 degrees, which makes the wear rate increase sharply. When buying a Peugeot 407, it is recommended to check the box in a cold state after a minimum warm-up and a mandatory performance check after a full warm-up, for which you need to drive 10–15 kilometers around the city. A very rare 4-speed ZF 4HP20 is reliable, but little known for the masters. Despite its German origin, it was installed mainly on French cars of the D and E classes. With runs far beyond 200,000, repairs are usually required due to wear of the clutches, problems with the valve body or solenoids. Also, the Peugeot box has problems due to the control unit, but in general, the unit has established itself as very tenacious and reliable with diesel engines. The 6-speed AM6 gearbox is the good old Aisin TF80SC, a version supplemented and improved relative to the TF60SC, which we know well from Volkswagen cars. In general, a very successful gearbox is rare on a Peugeot, unlike, for example, a Volvo. I will briefly explain that the box loves clean oil and its frequent replacement and still doesn't tolerate overheating due to contamination of the cooling system, abnormal anthers of the engine compartment, etc. Like other 6-speed ones, it is not designed for eternal operation and is structurally rather complicated. The box is less susceptible to self-destruction than AL4, and on average it lasts longer before overhaul. If the oil change interval for 60,000 km is observed, you can safely count on 200,000 mileage. However, the repair itself is much more expensive due to the complexity of the design. The bulk of the Peugeot 407 in Russia is equipped with gasoline engines. A fairly successful and well-presented line of diesel engines, due to the persistence of stereotypes, was not popular. Among the gasoline engines, the bulk is made up of the EW series engines inline 4-cylinder engines with a volume of 1.8 to 2.2 liters. Pre- and post-styling motors are structurally different. So before restyling, engines have a phase regulator only on the intake shaft, a conventional low-temperature thermostat. After the restyling of the motors, the control system was changed, a second phase regulator and a control thermostat appeared. The design of the engines is moderately conservative. The block is aluminum, the sleeves are cast iron, the timing belt is driven by a belt. The engine is designed for medium viscosity oils, 5W40, 10W40, and not lower. It is slightly lightened due to the plastic inlet. In later versions, it has a collector. Electronic choke individual coils. The 2.2 motors also have a removable balancer shaft block in the crankcase. Otherwise, within the line, the motors differ in piston stroke and cylinder diameter, and the cylinder piston group and the crankshaft of the EW7, EW10, EW12 motors are not unified. The piston stroke for 1.8 engines is 81.4 mm, for 2.0 engines 88 mm, and for 2.2 all 96 mm. The diameter of the cylinder is also different for everyone, 82.7, 85 and 86 mm respectively. This slightly facilitates overhauls with a bore for 2.0 engines, but by today's standards it is completely not technologically advanced. Peugeot's engine indices are rarely used and they prefer to designate engines by series. So engines 1.8 are EW7J4 series before restyling and EW7A after. Only dismantling workers usually remember about the codes of 6FZ and 6FY motors, since the motors have a very high unification within the line without strong differences over the years. Similarly, 2.0 engines are EW10J4 before restyling and EW10A after, with RF and RFJ indices. And only 2.2-liter engines have the same EW12J4 series code, but it has differences within the series. Engines with indexes 3FZ and 3FY have different control systems and intake exhaust elements. Confused? Still wood. These motors are very reliable. The resource of their piston group exceeds 350 or even 400,000 kilometers and is limited mainly by an increase in oil appetite. However, it often grows due to leaks. Motors are very prone to them due to the average quality of rubber seals, the increased temperature of versions after restyling, and the simplest crankcase ventilation system. The piston group cokes mainly due to the high oil change intervals. The Europeans were allowed to change it as much as every 30,000 kilometers and age. For the sake of increasing the service interval, Peugeot went for a little trick. After restyling, the engines have a slightly different crankcase shape and a different oil dipstick, which in total increases the volume of oil in the engine to about 5 liters versus 4.25 liters on engines before restyling, which allows them to better tolerate very long maintenance intervals. However, this is the case when there is no need to focus on Europe. An attempt to exceed the standard 10,000 interval in Russian conditions ruins the engine even faster than that of Europeans and is highly discouraged. So even with 15,000 interval between maintenance, the engine usually acquires stable oil appetite after 150 to 200,000 mileage. Depending on the type of oil and operating conditions, it begins to grow little by little, progressing from 200 grams per thousand to a liter and higher when the engine is sent for overhaul. Breakdowns of motor electrics and other anti-pollution fault failures unfortunately are frequent, but to be honest, they are not a big problem. You can ride with them for years, search for and eliminate for causes for a long time, difficult and expensive, so the owners often simply ignore them. True, in some cases, electronics doesn't allow the engine to spin about 3,000 revolutions per minute, and this is critical for not very powerful gasoline-aspired engines, and this is where chip tuning is quite relevant. Engine 3.0 is ES9A V6 with 60-degree camber. The motor developed jointly by PSA and Renault appeared in the 90s. Renault calls it XFV. Aluminum block, cast iron sleeves, timing belt drive, no balance shaft for a well-spare cylinder. A fairly standard design for the 90s with a good margin of safety and without childhood illness. The comparatively low degree of forcing provides a good resource and a very pleasant soft external characteristic. Unfortunately, the fuel consumption of 407 with this engine is too large, on average for 15 liters in city mode and on highway more than 8-9 liters, even with the new 6-speed automatic transmission. In terms of operation, the motor has enough nuances. For example, a very strange cylinder numbering order can make it difficult to diagnose a typical ignition malfunction problem. Not everyone will guess to look at the manual and find out that the French have a very different numbering order from the traditional one. For the same reason, problems occur when replacing the timing. The belt, by the way, is very reliable and can travel over 100,000 kilometers, but in frosty regions it's better to limit yourself to an interval of 60,000, especially if the engine sweats a lot with oil. With crankcase ventilation and oil leaks, everything is also not very good. In short, the ventilation of this engine in winter can freeze up during prolonged idle operation or fast movement along the highway, and simply the increased pressure of crankcase gases in winter has been repeatedly noted as one of the features of the engine. Leaks of oil seals and gaskets are a common thing. The engine leaks not only after frost but also after overheating, so when buying it is worth checking the leaks of the front cover at the timing belt and leaks of plastic covers, cylinder head oil separators and the presence of oil in the wells of the candles. It is also worth noting that in the case of using poor antifreeze, the aluminum pipes in the rear of the motor and the pump housing suffer greatly from corrosion. You are unlikely to hear frankly negative reviews about this motor. With normal maintenance, its resource is more than 400,000 kilometers. It is well thought out and easy to repair, except the access to the candles of the second row of cylinders is difficult, but this is a typical trouble on V6 engines installed transversely. Electrical problems with sporadic errors are just as relevant here as for inline fours. Diesel engines are very rare, but they can be safely recommended for purchase. On this, information about the problems of Peugeot 407 is exhausted. If you know more or do not agree with what you heard, I'm waiting for you in the comments.